Well, hello everyone, it's John Laughland here. I am the Director of Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. My co-hosts, Peter Lavelle from Moscow and Jeremy Nell from Cape Town, are delighted to welcome, as I am this week, as our guest, Ulrike Guérot, who is une habituée de la maison, who has already been on the show once before in July. And we're delighted to welcome her back. And in fact, both of us are currently, as you can see, in the same place this week, which is a novelty. Ulrike came on the show in July 2025 to discuss the authoritarianism of the European Union. That was the subject just under a year ago. About a month ago, we had a fellow German, Tariq Cyril Amar, he teaches at the University of Istanbul, very brilliant man, to talk about repression in the European Union. So this is a subject that we've dealt with many times, and it's one obviously that's very close to our hearts. And today, Ulrike, we wanted to pick your brains about the specific situation on, let's say, freedom of expression and why not human rights generally in Germany. You're from Germany and you have been, I think, a victim, let's say, of repression in Germany. Ulrike.
Yeah, John and friends, I'm happy to be here. And yes, I was, to be honest, a little bit shocked when I saw the thumbnail and repression, because repression is normally a word that you associate with really sharp dictatorships.
But it's in the title of the report that you drew my attention to.
I know, but it's not that I recommend a report that I'm signing for sort of, I just want to make the thing that repression is a very hard word.
Yes.
Yeah. And we are familiar as members of the Western family, the UK, France, and other countries, that we do not talk repression of our own countries. Yeah. So I think what I'm trying to say is that when these words come closer to you, and these words come closer to your political sort of establishment you have been familiar with. You know, I'm 61 years, I lived in the Federal Republic of Germany, and I always had a good loyalty to my state. And I was always convinced that the Federal Republic, as much as the French Republic or the Belgium or all the other republics in the European Union, are basically democratic and rule of law states, you know? So, and we would talk about regimes when we are talking about whatever, Moscow or China, but we had a clear distinction of which side are the democracies and which side are the others, the evils, And I think what we are discussing, saying beyond the term repression, is that there is now a growing feeling among citizens in the Federal Republic like me, but probably also in other countries of the European Union and in the European Union itself, when it comes to EU sanctioning policies and so, that we have the feeling that member countries of the European Union and the European Union itself, which defines itself as a rule of law body, are no longer in compliance with what they pretend to be. I think this is the state of the art, And if you had a talk last week about the European Union authoritarianism, then probably everybody thinks about the sanction lists and about Jacques Beau and about other journalists that have been dramatically sanctioned. There is a Turkish journalist living in Germany, which is also on the EU sanction list. And as you know, this is without any court ruling. And then you cannot even defend yourself because there's no legal body you can go against. You're not even informed about being on the EU sanction list. You basically read it in the newspapers, but in the same moment, your bank account is frozen. You can't get money. You can't so nourish your family. That's the case of this Turkish journalist in Germany who has 2 children in Basage, in minor children. And then the other thing is that it is not allowed to help these people, because if you give them cash or even if you provide them with nutrition, you are basically also ending up on the sanction list. So in the case of
Ulrike, explain to us, what is the official rationale? What is the explanation they give the public for this kind of egregious behavior? And more broadly, I'd like to know, what is the ethos, maybe of Germany, but maybe the European in general? What is the ethos of liberal democracy and freedom of speech? I mean, obviously, it's hugely at odds with what we understand it to be. How do they justify it?
Look, I mean, I think there is. I mean, I guess some of you may know Pascal Lottach, who wrote a super text on Substack on it, yeah, and basically saying that we are back to the Middle Ages, yeah, because this is not only illegal, this is extra legal, yeah, because there's no court ruling, there is no political body to go against. So in the judicial reform, this is medieval, yeah. And so I think the question is not really how you allow this or justify it, yeah, because the amazing thing is that this happens daylight time on the soul of the European Union, and that especially most press is silent about it. Yeah, very few people know about Gbagbo. There was obviously manifestation. There were signature lists that were sending around on a global scale. Pascal Lottach organized one of the, of the list, and Patrick Barb, a German friend of mine, organized another signature list. There are little reports in the Berliner Zeitung. The Berliner Zeitung is one of the last journals which is a little bit outside of mainstream, so to say. But if you look at the sort of big bold press in Germany, say Spiegel or Zeit or FAZ, Süddeutsche, what have you, they are not scandalizing it. Yeah. So the one thing is that it happens. The other is that it is silenced. And then to give you that one, there is a journalist in the press conference, Bundespressekonferenz, where the journalists can pose questions. Yeah. And Florian Warwick is his name. Everybody can look him up on Google and then go. And he posed the question in the press conference to the spokesperson of the government, sort of what is the position of the government with Gbagbo. Gbagbo is living in Belgium, so you may say that's not, and he is Swiss, yeah. So it's the Swiss authorities, the Belgian authorities, yeah. But the Turkish the journalist with Turkish background, he's German citizen, he lives in Germany, yeah. And so the question was, what is the German government to do to pull these people off the sanction list? And the answer of the spokesperson was, we won't do anything about it and we will continue. Yeah. And actually it's affecting.
Well, that's not an answer.
Well, yeah, but what do you want me to say in terms of justification? I'm not justifying it. I'm just a German citizen.
No, but I'm just saying how they justify it. Okay,
well, they justify it. You can go on the website of the European Council, which imposes these sanctions, and they say that it is to change behavior. They say it is not a criminal procedure. It's to change behavior. All right. So it's quite explicitly political and therefore completely arbitrary. However, as Ulrike said, it is a criminal offence. The European Union doesn't have any competence in criminal matters, in criminal law, but it is required through a directive, the member states of the European Union, to prosecute as criminals anybody who breaks sanctions. Now, I don't know whether it goes to the extent of taking food around to Gbagbo so that he can live, but potentially it does.
What it makes, for instance, because Gbagbo has published his book at the same publishing house than I do at West End Publishing House. Yeah, it's a very serious publishing house sitting nearby Frankfurt. By the way, has just as we speak 3 books on the German best-selling list. So it's a very substantial publishing house. Yeah. The moment that Gbagbo ended up on the sanction list, the publisher had to push to can't sell his books any longer, yeah, and had to take down all the videos that West End Publishing House had done with Gbagbo to take off YouTube, yeah. So there's a clear sort of regulation that if my publisher and Gbagbo's publisher would not do this, he would be in infringement with EU legislation. Yeah, and then we are talking about an EU legislation which actually, with some loops, but basically has the point that you need to take books from a market. Yeah, and speaking as a German, I do not want to recall history, whatever we are thinking about these things. Yeah, but again, there are 2 factors. The one factor is it is happening in daylight, and the other is that there's a silencing. Very few people talk about it. I'm talking now with you about it in an online forum, which has a fragmented sort of listener market. We are not talking at the evening journal in ZDF where it should be, where it should be. And so the conformity pressure that, because there is a very interesting question to me, why the journalists are not talking about
that. You mentioned Pascal Lottaz, or I don't know how he pronounces his name, Lottaz. I think he said without a Z. But we've been on his show, Peter and I. Peter seems to have disappeared for a moment. And he's been on the forum as well. So we know each other a little bit through these podcasts. And he, of course, did a very good interview with Jacques Beau. And in that interview with Jacques Beau, you mentioned conformity, the herd instinct. Jacques Beau says, well, there are the sanctions, which are the rules laid down by the European Union. And then you have a lot of other private actors joining in. He mentioned Fnac, which is a big bookshop in France that has stopped selling his books, even though there's no obligation on Fnac not to sell his books. But Ulrike, can we also broaden the discussion beyond sanctions? Because in the LiberNet report that you drew my attention to, it's not just about sanctions, it's about the whole, what now for many years has been called the censorship industrial complex, which exists in the United States of America, it exists in Europe, it exists at the national level and at the supranational level. And it involves typically the government, various supposedly independent agencies, fact checkers, very often in universities, NGOs and so on. That's why you often have these organograms, don't you, of the censorship industrial complex. And part of that, of course, also takes place at the European Union level with the European Democracy Shield, the Digital Services Act, and so on. Perhaps you'd like to tell us something about that.
I mean, first, to listeners who don't know about this report, it's in the internet. You can go www.liber-net.org. And LiberNet is a global NGO that is focusing on free speech. And LiberNet worked, the director is Andrew Löwenthal, actually he's Australian by nationality, and I know him personally. And when I first met him 2 or 3 years ago, he said that LiberNet was working on Asian, democracies and monitoring Asian democracies. Yeah. And then at some point he basically said, okay, but perhaps in Europe, because Europe was not monitored. Yeah. I mean, we were so off because we were so the best Democrats, blah, blah. There was no idea that we might be affected by shrinking space of freedom and need to be monitored. Yeah. And then LiberNet started monitoring the US. They did the first report about the US to basically find out where the bias come from. Yeah. I mean, because it's censorship and repression. That's why I started about repression. As you know, I push you, whatever. Yeah. Repression is pretty violent, sort of in the habitus. Yeah.
Yeah.
But what we are talking about is more about, as you said, conformist sort of movements of society, which more or less does all of this voluntarily, being silent about Jacques Beau. Nobody instructs you to be silent about Jacques Beau, but people are. Yeah. Right. So there is a self-infliction process. And the LiberNet report wanted to analyze how this goes. Yeah. The long story short is it's about money. Yeah. And the money is that, especially because the report is the first report was about the US, the second is about Germany. So the second report is censorship network in Germany. Yeah. And it details in terms of money flows, what money from which ministry has been spent on which topic to basically enhance a specific discussion or a specific opinion. We know from neurology that if people hear things 2 or 3 times, they believe it. Yeah. So there is a PR method, which is if you only hear things often enough, then you believe it. So now, go on COVID, go on Ukraine war, Putin is Hitler, go on Israel, go on the migration topic or on the climate topic. Yeah. In essence, what the report says, if you spend enough money to shift the discussion in that sense, then you shift it in that sense. The data for Germany are not only striking in terms of the money engaged. Yeah, there's more or less thousands and hundred thousands of millions of money engaged to hate speech, climate protection, diversity. All these sort of sensitive issues where society is heating up about. And what you basically can see is to draw a relation between the money spent and the discourse going in one direction. Yeah. And then the interesting thing is obviously that if you have a discourse going into the opposite direction than the one which is basically funded with money, then you are cancelled. Yeah, so that is a relation. The discourse that is funded is basically the good discourse, and discourse that is not funded is the critical opponent accused, and then you are cancelled. And I can talk in a moment about my own case. But what is perhaps the last sentence? Very interesting to see. And I detailed this many times. The figures, all these diagrams, yeah. It started in 2012, 13, 14 with the money spending, a little bit. You see some money, yeah. But the thing really goes up in 2016.
Yes.
So what happened in
Yes.
2016? It was the first mandate of Trump, and it was Brexit.
Exactly.
Yeah? So you feel what you can empirically prove with this censorship report is that the moment that a certain liberal elite with a certain discourse coalition, yeah, climate, migration, diversity, whatever, transgender, NATO, Russia is bad, whatever we will say that this liberal elite is thinking, that in 2060, when they feared that they would not dominate the discourse any longer because of Brexit and Trump, the figures of spending go up really a lot. And then came migration crisis, is also 15, 16.
Yep.
Then came Corona. You see the pillar going up again, ever more. And then to 22 comes the Ukraine war, and you see the figures ever more going up.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that tells us in a pretty science research way and empirically proven, because what's also interesting is there's not only the printed report, but if you go on the website of Libanet, they have put a data bank behind. So you can hang around with the data.
Ulrike, when you talk about spending, I mean, this is government spending, NGOs that are supported by the state. I mean, when you say money, who's spending the money?
Look, it's government money, but it also goes not only to NGOs, for instance, science institutions, yeah, DFG and other science institutions, which is affecting, the university
okay, but you say these elites, okay? Who are these elites? I mean, we're always talking about them, okay? I mean, who are these people that make the decision here? I mean, is there some kind of Politburo?
No.
Well, I think probably there is a Politburo involved, but I mean, are these political parties? I mean, who are we talking about?
Yeah. I think it's not so much about persons. It's about conformity and about money. Yeah, I would not say them are X, Y, and Z. These persons, and they are like
I mean, decisions are being made. I mean,
Well, there are some clear decisions. I mean, one of them you mentioned, 2016, is the year in which, in one of his last days in office, Barack Obama passed the Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act, which indeed created a huge flow of money generated by the American government into the American censorship industrial complex. So there are, of course, decision makers that take decisions.
Obviously,
but I think what you're saying is that it's like many manifestations of the herd mentality, it also has its own momentum, and people join in. And it's a very broadly, by the way, the incidence, the 2016 thing is extremely important, because the incidence of the word, another scientific measure of the word disinformation, also shoots up, because of course you've got various algorithms which can measure this very easily. So the very concept, in fact, or certainly the word, also shoots up from that point.
Shoots up from that point. Then fake news,
Absolutely,
I mean, before 2016, fake news, everything is news, bad information, good information, but who decides what is fake information? Yeah. And then that you have this control, fact checkers. Yeah, we didn't have fact checkers before. You would do an information, then the next guy would say you were wrong on this, and then you would correct the information, but you would not say this is fact checking, and because I'm fact checking, you don't have the right to do this. Yeah, so I agree that there's legislation behind, because you could not do this fact checking and fake news sort of thing if there weren't legislation behind. But I would still argue, and this is why I was stumbling about the word repression. I would still argue that it seems to be more a societal process of self-defense and conformity, because I would even argue that some of the people doing all this are really convinced that they want to save democracy.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm always trying to see what is sort of and I know many of, say, Green deputies, for instance, both in the European Parliament and in the German Parliament, But if you see them and with their discourses, say migration, say diversity, say transgender, whatever, climate, and then they feel threatened because they have now so much populist sort of discourse, and they feel really threatened in their argument, and their self-defense is we need to defend democracy because democracy is to have the rights for transgender,
that's defending, that's an authoritarian way to defend democracy, isn't it? I mean,
obviously, but that's their view. What Ulrike is saying is that their vision of democracy.
I'm not saying that they are.
It's liberal democracy.
I'm not saying that this is good to do so. I'm just saying, that if you use the word repression, I would still argue that most of the people, in essence, don't know what they do. I mean, they really pretend that they protect democracy by prohibiting
but you see, I think that was probably true of other repressive regimes. I think that the other brutal regimes that we think of, the Soviet regime is the most obvious example, because that's a regime where the word repression is used in Russian, repression. Surely many of those functionaries in Soviet Russia were also believed that they were defending progressive values against foreign manipulation and against irrational reactionary forces.
But still, I mean, whatever, we are not going into Stalinism now, and you really had physical repression, so let's not fool around. There is even sanction lists, whatever. It's not yet
having the state conducting surveillance against a major political party, I think we're getting close there. I'm sorry. I think that's true. All right.
But again, my point is it the state, or is it the conformist sort of society that has?
That's what I want to ask
given up on its old democratic sort of behaviors. There's something about a typology, I mean, for instance, there is a very good book by Götz Ali in Germany, which is Wie konnte das passieren? And it talks again about the 30s in Germany.
How could that happen? How could it have happened?
And what the point that Götz Ali makes, and this is what I did a speech in Germany that was quite listened to on the corona on the COVID, this thing, And the argument of Götz Ali, the essential argument is that in the late 20s, early 30s, there was so much money pushed into the system, and so everybody benefited from the National Socialists. There was a huge sort of, I benefit, it's getting better for me, I take money out of this. And then came the first regulations on euthanasia, and then came the first sort of crimes. But because before everybody had been benefited, nobody was critical, because I have been, so I do not want to point my finger on this, because I'm also in the benefit team. So now look at the COVID things, and I know I do not want to compare pears and apples. But there was a huge system, and I checked this, and you can read for those who read German, I presented a discourse in the Landtag of Hessen, in the Hessen Regional Chamber, and the discourse is on the internet, it's in visual, and it's in text, Then I checked that in Germany there were 8 billion, Milliarden, spent on PR campaign on why COVID vaccination is sure, blah, 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 So now, there were a lot of people benefiting from the COVID vaccination. All the medicines got a lot of money, and everybody was in a way was pampered with the money. 2 or 3 or 4 years later, it's evident that the promises that the PR said what the vaccination would do are not holding, but that perhaps it's a huge crime that has happened. We have a lot of evidence. So now the question is, what does society do? Those that have been pampered, because there was doctors getting €100 per vaccination, whatever, are they pointing to their neighbor? Because they must know that if I point to my neighbor, then perhaps somebody will point at me. So what Götz Ali says is the moment that you have created a community of, in Deutsch, eine Schuldgemeinschaft.
A community of guilt,
A community of guilt. It's interesting because the German word guilt and debt is the same, It's interesting.
Yes,
In
it's true. It's
Germany,
debt, exactly.
debt and guilt is the same word,
Yeah.
Schuldgemeinschaft. Yeah. But the moment you have a Schuldgemeinschaft, a community of guilt, you can do with that community whatever you want.
Or rather, a community of people who owe something, who are in debt.
There you go.
Can I?
I've
got a question for Ulrike.
Yeah, but this society can be blackmailed.
Yeah.
Because you can say, if you don't do this and you don't do this, I will point to your crime that you have been doing. And the interesting comparison, I think the societal effect which we are in is pretty much this.
Jan, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm listening with great interest, and obviously being at the bottom tip of Africa, my perspective is obviously quite different, and so it's very interesting being an onlooker from this side of the world. Something I've often wondered, Ulrike, is we often talk about those above us being repressive or oppressive. It's always them versus us. It's the structures that are more powerful than us. And you mentioned something earlier, that those around us can significantly influence the way in which we communicate. So in other words, do we censor ourselves more than what the state structures censor us? And is that potentially more dangerous because we're too scared to say the wrong thing?
I mean, first, it's precisely what I want to go against. I'm not among those who say it's the state, it's them, and they do. Yeah, I just was trying to make the point that there are subtle processes of society, and I just elaborated on one, which is the community of guilt, in which you see things changing. And I guess many people, at least not most, but many are aware of the changes, but either intimidated or they have kids to nourish or this or that, whatever. Yeah. So that stepping out of the herd is really, really difficult. I mean, let's not face it. Not everybody is born a hero. Yeah. And if you are facing clear disadvantages in terms of money and your kids and your school and whatever, that is a very easy way to basically shift people to some things. Yeah. And that is, again, why I was opposing the term repression. And that is, again, why I'm opposing the term up there is these, people, puppet on the strings, whatever them. Because in a way, what you may argue, we are in an even worse situation than, say, the totalitarianism of the last century. Because if this sort of state and society thing can't be separated any longer, and if today sort of the mismanagement comes from the society in itself because people are less courageous, or perhaps they are more, wie sagt man, verwöhnt, they are more spoiled, and they don't want to renounce on their third car, or whatever it is, yeah. But in a way, I mean, in parentheses, yeah. But if there's a bloody state and it's pushing you into prison and whatever, then at least you know where the terror comes from,
Exactly.
and the borderline is clear. But if you enter just a dining party and you don't know, how clear can I be on Israel, Gaza, Iran, migration?
That's a very, very good point.
What
Yeah.
what do you do?
And that's a big difference. Sorry, Jem, go ahead.
Yes. No. I was just going to add by asking the ultimate question: why? Why are these trajectories pointing in this particular direction? Is it simply the natural flow of chronological history, or is there something driving this?
Well, I mean, we have this saying of Zilone, who basically said 40 or 50 years ago, when fascism will come back, it will not come back in brown boots, but it will come back in a suit. Yeah. So in a way,
and a pat on the back, and a pat on the back.
Yeah. In a way, we are just here. Yeah, because the real question is, can you make a difference between the person that goes to a ministry in the morning and does all this regulation and sees perhaps that this is somehow uncool, yeah, but in the evening he goes back with his car and has a wife and has 2 kids, and I mean, where do you do? Basically, this is what you would say formerly was fascism, yeah, where the different, I mean, there is a definition of fascism that is, if you clump the state and eine Verklumpung, if you clump the state and the society with the church on top, yeah, or the economy and the state, then this clumping, sagt man Verklumpung, is the moment of fascism, yeah, which is precisely that you can no longer differentiate that is their state who does, because there is no such thing than the state. The state is an abstract notion because the state are the teachers, are the doctors, are the lawyers, are the judges who, for instance, in the years of Corona, more or less all were, say, I wouldn't say failing, but had difficult comportments. Yeah.
So my listening to you, what I'm reminded of, what a British historian A.J.P. Taylor wrote somewhere. He said that we don't study history in order to understand the present. Instead, it's by understanding the present that we better understand the past.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that what we now call totalitarian regimes come about rather in the way that you've described. I think we over-caricature totalitarian regimes with the jackboots and the uniforms and the KGB and everything. There were, I believe, also these social horizontal mechanisms, anthropological mechanisms that were subtle mechanisms. So yes, you're quite right. Of course, if it's a very brutal regime, that's an extremely important point. And I think this says a lot, by the way, about the history of Central and Eastern Europe today. The strange phenomenon that the east of Europe, the former communist parts of Europe, are more impervious to wokeism and liberalism.
Yes.
They're more resistant to it. And I think that's because for many generations,
that's right,
they knew that they were free around the kitchen table. But as you've just said, Ulrike, we in the West, we don't even feel free around the kitchen table anymore.
Well, here's the thing. There is Ariane Belleran, for those who want to read. Yeah, Ariane Belleran is a French clinical psychologist. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she said during Corona, there were three parts of society which resisted to the déferlement totalitaire, so the totalitarian wave. And the three parts of society are first people who have a belief system, so spiritual, they're religious, yeah, so they believe in something higher than person, yeah, which is they weren't afraid of the virus, sort of death is still Erlösung, so death is
salvation,
salvation, yeah. The second were the manufacturers, those who still work with their hands and their, stomach and they bakery, whatever they gardening, yeah. And the third, as you said, those who have already experienced a totalitarian regime, so dictatorship, yeah. And this is what makes, we are talking about Germany here, the huge division between the people in the eastern part of the country and the western part of the country, because the western part for years and decades thought we are the better Democrats. There's this ugly GDR. We are the best Democrats. Yeah. So by tradition and by self-understanding, nobody in the former Federal Republic would believe that they could be wrong because the others were the wrongs. Yeah, the GDR were the wrong. Yeah, exactly. And so came Corona and came a certain, let's call it déferlement totalitaire. I mean, listen to what I said in the Hessischer Landtag. Yeah, it was pretty clear that we had 8 billion of PR and whatever happened then. Yeah, but the thing is that the GDR people reacted in the way they reacted and say, oh, that smells like something. Yeah. Whereas the former Federal Republic people said, yeah, this is for the good. This is because we are the best Democrats, and so we do it for the good. And it's precisely, in a way, the Milgram experiment. Remember the Milgram experiment, yeah? I mean, we knew from Adorno and his research that nobody wants to be ugly and bloody and whatever, yeah? Everybody always wants to do the good. So if somebody tells you we need to do Corona and protect you and the other and separate people and do lockdowns for the good, for the survival, yeah? Who has the intellectual capacity to move out of that PR and to say, no, that's a Milgram experiment. I'm told I do it for the good, but basically I do something very nasty for society, yeah? So, I mean, resist an 8 billion PR campaign, you need a lot of strength in your head, right? And so, I'm not sitting here to blame people, or to finger pointing. I think we have been facing huge societal processes, huge money flows, huge bias of, discourses. And who would say from himself or herself, oh, I am super intellectual, clear seer, and I'm going through all of this.
Ulrike, I agree with your description. I think it's fantastic, and I think the nuance is that how people buy into the system for the reasons they do. But the European Union isn't doing very well, and Germany's not doing very well. I mean, is this approach to public life, is that going to continue? I mean, it seems like it's a well-oiled, well-moneyed machine, but it's not creating positive social goods. So, I mean, we're kind of in a trap, aren't we?
Look, I'm a professor, and as some may know, I have been fired from Bonn University in February 23 because of plagiarism. The plagiarism is a percentage of the book with some wrong mistakes. Yeah, I mean, nothing. Just really, I mean, I have made this all public on my website. You can look at the mistakes. It's really small and minor mistakes, and it's not even in an academic book.
Plagiarism is a well-known instrument in Germany.
Okay.
It's a well-known instrument
I
in
was
Germany.
in academia. There are some people that get caught for using a few words, and then there are other people that plagiarize an entire book and become rich and famous. Okay, I'm not going to name.
It's important to say that it's a well-worn instrument in Germany for eliminating political enemies.
Yeah. Okay. So, and thank you for saying this, because it's a well-known instrument. Yeah. Because and here it comes sort of, because we were talking repression, but what we are talking more precisely is what you would call in Germany the legal principle of Verhältnismäßigkeit, proportionality, and of equality in front of the law. Because in fact, there are three major cases in Germany of plagiarism. One is Alena Briggs, who was the director of the ethic councils during Corona, and she was wrong and did many mistakes, and 50% of her PhD are plagiarism. The second is Mario Vogt, who is the governing minister president of Thüringen, which is one of the Eastern Länder. And the third is Brosius Gersdorf, who is a professor women for law in University of Hamburg. And all the three have major parts between 30 and 50% in their dissertations, so in their academic work, of real plagiarism. In proportion, I have 1.5%, so 1.5% to 40% in a non-academic work. So I have been picked for minor mistakes and thrown out of university, whereas other people remain at university. Brosius Gersdorf wanted to become constitutional lawyer, and there was a huge campaign against her. So finally, she could not become constitutional lawyer, but she's still at University of Hamburg. And Alena Briggs has a couple of positions, very prestigious positions. She's in the board of Charité Germany. She's in the board of Bertelsmann Foundation, because she was the president of the Ethic Council during Corona. So, and this, what I want to say here, speaks, I think, precisely to my argument I made beforehand, because Alena Briggs did so much, say, dirty things during her years with Corona Ethic Council. But because everybody worked with her, society cannot let her fall, and society cannot blame her, because then everybody else, if she falls, then everybody who was doing the wrong things with her would also fall. So I must go out of the system, because I am finger pointing to all this sort of, Corona mismanagement. That's in my speech in Hessen. But nobody wants to hear my accusations. But the community of debt, or the community of guilt, needs to protect Alena Briggs now, because if she falls, the whole sort of system of lies and everything would fall. And
but it will fall if it is based on lies. Okay, that's the.
It will fall. It will. But what we see for now is the sort of, if you want, so the societal fight up to which extent the society can protect these people. That's precisely what we are experiencing. And that's why I'm talking. Repression, I think, is a different thing. But and this is why I'm now going probably to the Constitutional Court, because I have been losing all my legal cases. By the way, it's pretty exhausting, but there's still the Constitutional Court level. And as we know, professors in Germany should not be cancelled for opinion. So in my case, for writing a book, two books. I wrote one book on Corona and the other book on Ukraine. in both books there are no mistakes. I mean, no content mistakes. Yeah, just some little whatever quoting mistakes. Yeah, and the very fact that the university did, how shall I say, one of my book on the Ukraine war was published on the 24th of October in 22, yeah? And 10 days later, the university openly distanced from me, yeah? Because of this book, yeah? So for me and my lawyers, this is now the best sort of document, yeah? And that was before the plagiarism was found by a commission. Yeah, so the real
Exactly.
the time sequencing points very much to the fact that I have been cancelled for opinion and for 2 books, and not for plagiarism. Yeah, and so I will bring this to the Constitutional Court, and we will see. Yeah. But in essence, in the legal thing, and again, you know, let's the repression, I think, is not the real word for what is happening. Yeah, for what is happening is the societal coverage of people who did things of whom we know the things were not good. Yeah, vaccination strategies and so much money engaged. Many people benefited from this. Yeah, and now this society, as a society of guilt, needs to protect those people who basically were in this path. Yeah,
I think that's very
and
good.
that is why I'm not finger pointing to the state and so. But what is happening now is that all these people being in this community of guilt, yeah, they are doing now the regulation, and they are now doing the spending to save democracy, because they are now eager to keep people like me out of the system, who would claim, look, that and that wasn't okay. Yeah. So I'm not in denial that there is legislation, and there are civil servants and parliamentarians who are voting all these things for the NGOs to promote democracy, as they say. Yeah. But I think it stems from the societal, eagerness that now they must stabilize the lines, to put it that way. Yeah,
I think it's an extremely important point that you're making. The social and anthropological pressures, the herd mentality. I've mentioned this before, I think, on the forum, but there's a wonderful essay by N.S. Lyons, The China Convergence. I'm sure I've mentioned it probably more than once, where he the title refers to his idea that Western societies, America and Europe, are becoming like China, or at least like he imagines China to be. and he makes the point very strongly that a system of this kind generates its own norms and its own systems. Because you have a power structure involving money, but also, as you say, money essentially all comes down to that, but also other things, social pressure, and norms will be generated within this system spontaneously, and if they reinforce the system, they will prosper, and if they threaten it, as you did, then they will be expelled. In other words, it's a living organism, which I don't want to say it runs on autopilot, because we agree there are, of course, the money has to come from somewhere and so on, but a large part of it is that.
And you can also remember Margaret and Alexander Mitscherlik's book, the incapacity to, die Unfähigkeit zu trauern, the incapacity
to trust.
Yeah, not to trust, to trauern. To
mourn,
the incapacity to mourn, and that's the book in the end of the 50s, when she basically would describe that we needed until the 68ers would bring up all this conformism during the Nazi years, and Mitscherlich said the incapacity for a society, let alone a state, to admit mistakes. That's the problem. A state cannot admit mistakes. And so you need to put the mistakes under the carpet. And so the people who are forming the state need to put everything on a carpet. And then Mitscherlich comes in and wrote this fantastic book about the incapacity of society to mourn. And before mourning, you need to admit there is a mistake. But who is the person who would say, for the German state, sort of, oh, sorry, we got that wrong with Corona. We basically lied to you about a vaccine. I mean, who would do this? And who would do this? And here it comes, who would do this if money is engaged? Because the moment you do it, you get.
Well, I know the best example. Who's going to admit about the whole Nord Stream fiasco?
Exactly.
Who's going to admit that?
Because then there's money engaged. If you were to admit it, you had you would need to endowage people. You would need to have a fund for vaccinated people. For I mean, you would need to go against Pfizer.
I think it's even worse than that. I know I'm repeating myself, but in that wonderful play Biedermann and the Fire Raiders, Biedermann and die Brandstifter, the fact is that the play tells the story of a man who lets rooms in his house to terrorists, and he will not accept that his terrorists are actually in his house. And the final line of the play, I've quoted this many times before, one of the arsonists comes down and asks him to lend him a match. And he gives the arsonist a match and then turns to his wife and said, but if they were arsonists, they would have their own matches.
Yeah.
And in the case of Nord Stream, Peter, the people who are burning our house down or blowing our gas pipelines up are in our house. And
Yes.
that is a truth which is psychologically impossible to accept, because the truth is too much to bear.
You would also go back to the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. Die Hölle sind die anderen.
Hell is other people.
The hell is the others. It's not the state, not those elites. I mean, I know that there is a lot of also resentment in Germany about these elites, and they are betraying us, and so. And then I always say, look, there is also this book, Hitler's freiwillige Helfer. Hitler alone, who would have been? I
exactly.
mean,
Hitler's willing executioners.
I mean, Hitler alone would not have done a thing. Had there not been other people who, by the societal movement, the societal movement is very hard to detect, very subtle. You cannot even say it's here, it's here, it's here. It's like a pudding at the wall. It's just a whole, you say, a living organism. A living organism that now creates its new legal structure and its new sort of behavior forms, and the new, and then you can, the society goes there, and there's some individuals who say, oh, I don't like this, but it's very few individuals, and that makes it so hard.
Ulrike, I mean, going back to Jacques Beau and people like that, is in Germany, and then by extension the European Union, is there a growing acceptance that there are serious political dissidents? I mean, I mean, if we're talking about what society accepts, well, if they're never said to be dissidents, but if they're treated as dissidents, there must be a good reason for it. I mean, it's interesting when we look at the totalitarian mindset. I remember I had a professor from Hungary. He was there during the Stalinist period, and when and John, you know the history very well. When you would have the traitors and the wreckers, and they would be put on trial. And I asked him, I said, Professor, I mean, surely people didn't believe that. And he said, oh, they all believed it. Oh, they certainly all believed it. Okay.
Yeah. But that's the thing. So I think this is very complex theme. And in terms of dissidents, I mean, just pointing to this book, there's a book about disrupting the university. It's available in English on Amazon. And that says that since 22, there are some 60 professors that have been eliminated from German universities. I'm just probably the most prominent case, but I'm not alone. And the very fact that I do this lawsuit thing is also to cover all the others, because somebody needs to make the case, But here we go with this sort of dissident thing, and the real question is, when do you come into acceptance of reality? I mean, the problem is again money flows. I mean, a society works with money, and stepping out as a dissident requires that either you are very wealthy and you can allow, but even then, what do you do? Or you are perhaps in a monastery. But it's not so easy to step out of society. And so if we now see that we have a sort of what I would call the neutralization of critique. This is not me. This is Marina Garcés. She's a Spanish philosopher from Zaragoza. And she wrote a marvelous book in 2016 about a new enlightenment. And in this book, at the end, she says, what we are experiencing is a sort of neutralization of critique. And it's not precisely not repression. I shoot you, whatever.
Yep.
Yeah. It's just like I squeeze your bank account.
Yep.
I take you. I don't give you a job. You are out of university. You can talk. You can do an online thing. You have free expression. We are here. We're sitting in a Zoom. We will be looked by whatever 20,000 people. Where is the shrinking space? Yeah, we have all the space we want. So the problem is that I think this neutralization of critique is that as much as you would probably agree that we can no longer distinguish between left and right because this is amalgamating, we can no longer distinguish between the society and the dissidents, because the neutralization of critique is that it's all becoming fluid, and I think we must have a much broader philosophy. I could make the philosophical point that we are taking out the object subject sort of dichotomy of the philosophical system, but that's another another discussion. But I think there is a huge thing because we are men and women, we are no longer distinguishing left and right, no longer distinguishing. I had a new iPhone software which is now this fluid system sort of thing. So you can see that there is something about a transhumanism is machine and man. So I think there is a very fundamental philosophical point here to make, which we do not make here. But that's why I'm saying repression is not really it. There is something about a state society amalgamation which makes even the notion of dissident very hard to understand, because what we're talking about is a neutralization of critique, and the neutralization comes either from conformism, I renounce voluntarily on critique, and that is why the system is losing self-corrective capacity. Because
how do we push back though?
Yeah, exactly.
How do we push back? I mean, what is the solution?
Look, I mean, posing the right question is the most important intellectual part, and that is what we did. So I think I tried to pose some valid intellectual questions. Now, ask me, it's 1 hour.
Yeah, but Ulrike,
I taught 3 hours of class, so.
Isn't this we talk about the decline of the West and what maybe our culture, our civilization, but it seems like from what you're saying that liberalism is super succeeded, because you can't no longer can interrogate it. It's no longer a subject. We're it. I mean, it's a fundamentally depressing message.
I first would agree that, for instance, the Chinese talk of today is neo-Marxism. So the Chinese have a very interesting discussion about neo-Marxism. I would also bet that liberalism is finished. There is a very interesting book, The End of the Liberal Order of the World, or so. I can't remember the author, but The End of the Liberal Order, it's a book on the market. Then there's another book on the market, which is from a Pakistani British person, and the title is The World Will Survive the End of the West. So what we are discussing is just our problem. There is the BRICS country, there is Iran now changing the global order, there is China, there's Russia, and these people, in philosophical terms, they have not been going through post-modernity. They're still culturally stuck in modernity, but modernity had categories, modernity had definitions, modernity had, was basically, if you want, before post-structuralism, before Foucault, or Derrida. So there is, structuralism and post-structuralism. So we deconstructed everything. We deconstructed the party system, the state, the men and women, every definition. So now, if the world is turning into, the BRICS sort of thing, you could say, so what? You have 300 million American and 500 million Europeans. That's not barely a billion. There is 3/4 of the world which is still, in a way, anti-liberal, in a positive sense, in the modernity and not the post-modernity, in the structuralism and not the post-structuralism. So let's just look at how this will unfold, and the only who will pay a price are us. Okay, who cares?
It does seem to me, though, that the counter response actually might be, dare I say it, a form of fascism or totalitarianism as a way to reintroduce those structures.
Break
those structures.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, on this, yeah, I would agree. And you see all this as we speak with the US-Iranian thing. Yeah, I mean, I do not go into details of this, whatever military missiles, blah, blah, blah. We see Trump saying this and that, then realizing a second after that he's not even able to do what he's trying to do. Yeah, so we see Iranian superiority in many respects, not only in the military sense, but also in the psychic sense. Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, the most decisive thing that you have seen, not only a country fighting against the US like Vietnam, but challenging the US. Yeah, because the Iranian president was basically saying, you want ground troops? Come,
Yeah.
come.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is something very fundamentally changing here. Yeah. And if you say that there is fascism coming, I would argue, yes, that you know, there's two ways to stabilize a political system, either by consentment, yeah, by support, or by force and violence. Yeah. We are accustomed and familiar that we stabilized all our Western political systems with support and consent. Yeah. And this is now gone.
Even if it's manufactured.
Even if it's manufactured, but it's gone. Yeah. So the risk that we need to have the other pillar of stabilizing a political system by violence, yeah, is sort of in the air. There's also David Betts from King's College, who has recently writing articles that there is a latency of European civil war in most of the European countries, because societies are heavily polarized between urban and countryside, and old and young, and analog and digital, and migrants and non-migrants, whatever, polarization at its best. Yeah. So what holds together a Western society when the social fabrics is gone? I always say to my students, yeah, I tell 3 hours, the republic is gone. We lost the republic. That's a very, very pathetic sentence. But losing the republic is also losing the social fabric, meaning nobody knows who he belongs to. Yeah, and that's probably the situation we are in. Yeah, so I agree with you that we need to hurry up, but two things. Yeah, the one is the authoritarian stabilization, and it probably comes through NATO and through armament, and that's precisely what the US is doing. I think that's the last attempt what they do, stabilizing through NATO. That's what we see in Iran. Me personally, I hope it will not work. Yeah, the other thing is betting on the, say, populist dissidents in the political system. Yeah. Here is my very quick argument in a sentence. I think most, and I studied this and wrote long articles about it, most of the so-called populist parties started with good critique, defending blue-collar workers, being anti-imperial, being anti-NATO, anti-Euro, anti-whatever. Yeah. 15 years later, they have been totally, sagt man, unterwandert, undermined. Yeah. So what basically the undermining the Greens from Petra Kelly to Annalena Baerbock, changing a party from green to olive, is now, that's my very short argument, happening with the so-called populist party.
Absolutely.
They are all undermined in terms of capitalism, in terms of pro-America Atlantic, pro-NATO, pro-Israel, and so
Maloney.
So my point would be that if ever we see today's dissident taking power in Europe, whatever, in France, Rassemblement National next year, or AfD, everything will remain the same, because by then they already undermined in the sense that the West has organized itself, which is capitalism, Americanism, Zionism, whatever. Yeah.
What an optimistic conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid I think Ulrike is right, particularly on the populist parties. I've been skeptical about them. And by the way, this brings us back to your original quibble with the word repression, because that suggests indeed that the people are being pressed down, and therefore if you somehow take it away, or if they push back up. But that's not at all how it works.
That's not the situation we are in.
I agree. I agree with that very strongly. I've always been skeptical about people say, oh, the people are waking up, and the people are waking up. Rubbish. They're not waking up. And anyway, if they are, the instruments of their so-called awakening have, as you say, been undermined and taken over.
I would agree, but still, I do not want to leave it on this sort of non-optimistic note, as Peter was saying, because you always need to be reminded of Václav Havel. Optimism is not that things will be better, but optimism is to do the right things, even though things won't be better. Yeah,
That's
and that's
very good.
it's Gramsci and dialectic. Yeah, and in that sense, unless we also bury dialectics, we still have a good chance.
Excellent. Ulrike, that's a very good motto or saying to end on. I've been taking notes as you've been speaking. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to the two co-hosts and to all our listeners, and see you again same time next week. Thank you. Bye.